Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of the Biodiversity podcast by Teasels. And I'm really looking forward to this podcast because I'm sitting down with Donald MacIntyre from Emorsgate Seeds. Hi, Donald.
Hello, Dan.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's nice to be talking with you.
Fantastic. Well, we've talked on the phone, and now we're seeing each other for the first time, so which is really great. So, Donald, do you want to give us a bit of background on yourself and sort of your past career, and give a better background on Emorsgate Seeds? Because for the uninitiated, it's quite a good brand of seed, and you've done a lot of great work over the last, is it 40 years now? It's 40.
Yeah, 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you can condense 40 years into a lovely soundbite, that would be a few sound bites. That'd be great.
Well, I wish I was 40, but I'm 71. So it's going to be impossible to, within an hour, give you my background. But generally, I'm a country boy, and I grew up hunting wildflowers with my mum, and went on to study botany at A-level. And then at university, at a whole string of universities, London, Glasgow, Reading, and then I did research on plant breeding.
Okay.
And eventually I thought I'd have a go, because I was always interested in seeds and genetics and the countryside and conservation and wildflowers. So I was well aware back in 1980 that our countryside was losing its wildflowers. So I was down and out in London, living in the East End, Woodford Green, and trying to make a living painting and decorating. But I had this idea that I might just start collecting weeds. And I walked around the wasteland of East London, which are really interesting areas, and hand collected in paper bags seeds of a range of species. And that's how it all started. I just put together a list of the seed I had at the end of the season and mailed it out to a number of seed companies. And it was different at that time because nobody was selling what they considered to be weeds. Garden plants, vegetables, agricultural seeds, but not wild seeds. So there's a lot of interest. That really kicked me off. One thing led to another, and that was in 1980. And it's been a very slow and gradual process of expanding the business since then. Now it is essentially a farming business. Yeah. And I always wanted to be a farmer, but I've managed to combine botany with farming. And we have about 750 acres under single species cultivation, native species, all native species, most of which is in Norfolk. And I've been helped along the way by the Norfolk County Farms Estate. Norfolk has a good and large and indeed growing farms estate where the county council provides startup farms for young people wanting to get into farming. And they helped me along the way, right from the beginning. And now I've got quite a large East Anglian farm on which we grow native seeds. Also a farm down in Somerset, near Bath, where I'm talking from.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you so you've got the farms in Norfolk and the farm just outside of Somerset. So there's different soil types there, isn't it? So you get a perhaps a different conditions that will favour certain species. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the difference in the soil type is quite pronounced. We're on the southern tip of the Cotswolds, and it's soil over limestone, and the soil is rocky, stony limestone, and high pH about 8.5. Yeah. None of the fields are level, and the fields are small. It's essentially an area of mixed farming, so there's a lot of grassland, woodland, and arable land. In Norfolk, it's completely different. It's the drained fens between Wisbech and Down Market and King's Lynn, in that triangle there. Yeah. It's silty land. It's silt. The silt varies from farm to farm, but it's essentially a deep neutral pH, about 6.5, sometimes higher, maybe up to 7.5, completely stone-free, and the water table is managed, so there's never a drought, and there's never flooding in the winter. So the internal drainage board, while we don't have too much sea level rise, managed to keep the fens, the water levels managed.
Yeah.
So the two locations allow us to grow a different range of species. Some species do not thrive in the fens, but will grow well on the stony, high pH, calcareous limestone that we have in the southwest, and vice versa.
Wow. So I want to go back a few steps, because you said back in the in the 1980s that you saw that the agricultural land was largely devoid of wildflowers. So can you give us a bit of background on that? Because you spotted that sort of 40 years ago, but now we're in, I don't know, we haven't progressed. I don't know, have we progressed in those 40 years in terms of maintaining the sort of native flora within our agricultural lands?
So in the post-war years, the common market subsidised the improvement of land.
Improvement.
Yes, improvement of lands to increase food production and to intensify food production. That involved drainage, removal of hedges, application of fertilizers and pesticides, and the modernization of the whole farming process, bigger tractors, bigger combines. And the consequence of that was that wild areas were eliminated. There's some very good data about lowland meadows, which were once very, very widespread, but they have been reduced now to only 3% of their former extent. So 97% have been destroyed. And that's because of ploughing, spraying with herbicide, application of fertilizer. And the botanical interest, the biodiversity, and everything that's associated with that goes, and you end up with what's called an improved grassland, which is essentially dominated by ryegrass. So it's a ryegrass grassland. So that's the overwhelming habitat that we have in the countryside today. Now, the rate at which those grasslands, those native grasslands, have been lost has declined in recent years, but that's only because we've only got 3% left to lose. So it's a statistical quirk. The rate of loss was greatest at the beginning, and as land was converted to intensive agriculture, the amount remaining for conversion became less and less. So other parts of the world where agriculture is not so advanced, then you do have rapid rates of loss of native vegetation. But in the British Isles, that rate of loss has now stabilised, simply because there's nothing more to lose outside of protected areas. Areas of outstanding natural beauty, triple SI, sites of special scientific interest, national nature reserves. Those areas are protected. So protected areas cannot be improved. Most of the other agricultural land has been improved. There's not much left that hasn't been improved.
So, okay, so with that, so, when you say it's improved, what is the process to kind of regenerate that? So say you've had a wildflower rich grassland which has been improved, had loads of fertilizer on it. The ryegrass has taken over and sort of really become a monoculture, if you like. So can you kind of dispel perhaps rumours that, well, not rumours, but give a bit of advice on perhaps how people can sort of bring back those wildflower rich grasslands?
So the countryside, the lowland countryside is divided roughly into grassland, arable land and woodland in the British Isles. And the method that this is within agriculture is slightly different within landscaping and a garden setting. But in the farming setting, there are two approaches. One is if you have arable which you wish to return to native grassland, then you're starting off with bare soil and you would sow onto that soil using standard agricultural practices a complete mixture of grasses and flowers.
Yeah.
And then that's called species-rich grassland creation.
Yeah.
There's also another way you can do that, and that's just turn away from it and set aside. We did have a set aside scheme back in the 90s, which farmers were required, when we had food mountains, where farmers were required to set aside 10% of their arable land, and that land was just left. And natural regeneration will result in grass cover, and without cutting, eventually it will result in woodland.
Yes.
So natural regeneration is another option. But where the species that you're interested in reintroducing are no longer present in the surrounding countryside, you cannot expect natural generation to give rise to a vegetation type including those species. For example, cowslip or pasque flower, which you have near you in Cambridge, and all the whole suite of plants which were once common in the countryside will not come back naturally if you just allow natural regeneration to take its course. Yeah. At least not within a reasonable time scale. If you were to set aside for maybe 500 years, you would get back to some of the species-rich chalk grassland that you have, say a third field common near to Cambridge.
Yeah.
But it does take a very long time. You can get there quicker by introducing the species. And so you put in the seedlings. Where you have areas of the countryside which are covered in improved grassland, dairy, beef production and sheep grazing areas, you can actually diversify the existing grassland. And that's a different technique. So you do not destroy the grassland that's there. There's a lot of it's not quite as straightforward as I'm going to make it out. Yeah. But actually, by a process of various agricultural non-destructive techniques, you add species to the existing grass and restore its diversity. And that's a very useful technique because it doesn't require the use of herbicides or ploughing.
Yes.
Some of the grasslands in the southwest are more devoid of wildlife. The dairy grasslands tend to be more devoid of wildlife than the arable cereal land that you have in the East Anglia. So there's a lot that can be done on grassland, diversifying existing grassland or sowing into arable land and creating species-rich grassland.
Interesting.
So yeah, gardens are a bit different, and so is landscaping.
Well, this is the thing, because it's quite interesting, because the more I look at it, the more I feel that, yeah, creating wild areas, wild meadows in gardens is important to a certain extent. But again, if we want to genuinely increase biodiversity and genuinely want to stop the slide of ecological collapse, we do have to take on a landscape scale, don't we? So it's more agricultural on a larger scale and on a more joined up scale. Would you agree?
The impact is greater on a larger scale, and it's through change in policy, which has a huge impact at a landscape scale on our visual landscape, on the biodiversity, and on the quality of the water, the quality of the air, and all these factors. But every little bit helps. Even if it's a square meter, a window box, it will still attract new plants and flowers. It will still attract insects. A small garden can make a contribution. So there's nothing too small. But obviously, the larger the area, then the bigger impact it's going to have overall. And there is, the world is a big place. And it's not just the British Isles. There's a movement worldwide to restore nature and for all the benefits that that can bring.
Yeah, very, very much so. So when you, with the seeds that you produce, do you want to talk a bit more about the sort of the native flora and the connection between the native flora and the native fauna, and how there's that connection between, you know, the flora and native flora and sort of the native flora as well, because there's perhaps a disconnect sometimes where people talk about pollinators and we talk about native flora, and sometimes it gets lost that a lot of these plants form part of the food web as well.
Mm. The plants are part of an ecosystem. It's the whole of life. So they're right, not quite, but they're right down at the bottom of the triangle that represents the ecosystem. They're the basis of the food chain, and they support, obviously, invertebrates, bugs, and the bugs support birds, and the plants also support us, and the pollinator services that provided by insects are very important to agriculture. So the ecosystem, we're part of the ecosystem, we're fairly near the top. But plants without the foundation provided by plants, there's no life on Earth.
Because it's something I want to stress, because I think sometimes it can get lost, especially within the garden realm, that it's just a nice aesthetic. It's just we'll have a nice meadow because that looks nice and that's very pretty, but it's a lot deeper than that, and it needs to be a lot deeper than that. It's kind of like we've been talking about. It's that restoration of a food web rather than just a bit of, I don't know, fancy horticultural wallpaper.
So our native flora is 1,400 species. And those species will support. I'm talking off the top of my head the number of invertebrates, but it's going to be about 50,000 invertebrate species, I would imagine, supported by that 1,400 plants, and likewise they support a whole range of other fauna. And you could just take one plant, for example, say cornflower, which is a wild cornflower. It's blue. It's very easy to grow. It's very pretty, and that requires pollination. It doesn't set seed without being pollinated, and it'll be pollinated by hoverflies and solitary bees and bumblebees. It's a species that provides for a lot of pollinator species, and it's a rewarding plant. It provides a reward to the pollinator, which is nectar and honey. And the nectar and honey is taken back to wherever the bees or the hoverflies have their brood, and is fed to the brood.
So again, can you just dispel something as well? Because again, it seems to come up in every podcast. Can you just clearly explain that there's more bees than the honeybee? Because again, everybody seems to think there's only one type of bee, and it's the honeybee. Could you again just underline that point, that there is a
the honeybee is not. The honeybee is actually our most abundant bee, but it is not native to the British Isles. It's a cultivated bee. And it's abundant because it has a commercial purpose in production of honey. We have 50, or just I think 48 species of bumblebee, and bumblebees are they're larger than the honeybee, and they have a round body. They're early pollinators because of their body size being larger. They warm up quicker in the spring, so that they pollinate earlier than honeybees. And then there's a whole range of solitary bees, another probably 100 species, which are they're not very showy, and they're really quite small. And they live in the ground in little tunnels, but they collect nectar and honey. So all of these bees collect and depend upon nectar and honey exclusively. That's the only food source.
Yeah.
Unlike butterflies, I might add, which collect nectar and honey, but that's only the adults. The larvae of butterfly, the caterpillars, mostly live off of maybe stinger nettles or grasses, but other food other than nectar and honey. But all of our bees have to have nectar and honey. Grasses do not produce any nectar or any honey. No. So if you want to attract bees, bumblebees, solitary bees, honeybees, you have to have flowers. Grass will not provide any nectar or honey. But yeah, our concept of weeds is changing and has changed in my lifetime. It depends on, it's an individual thing as well. It depends what problem you happen to have in your garden, and then that's the worst weed that they could possibly be. Farmers generally, and historically, not so much now, but in the past, have thought of every plant other than grass or as a weed. And equally, wildlife is, if you can't produce it into a saleable product, it has no place on the farm. So there is a tendency in the past to think of all wildlife as unwelcome and harmful. But things have changed, times are changing. And our definition of what is weedy has narrowed quite a lot. There's even the debate about invasive aliens, and they're not as bad as people originally thought. You mentioned nettles. Well, that's probably the second most invasive species in the British Isles, but it is native. And
because as you're talking, it is a debate perhaps we should have a bit more, because Himalayan balsam, well, it's a pain in the waterways, but it's a great source of nectar, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
I can slap my own hand by saying that, but it is.
Yeah. So there's a lot of research been done on Himalayan balsam. Impatiens glandulifera is very attractive. It's a good, provides pollinator services, but it's not been very easy to find good, strong, hard evidence that it is a harmful invasive alien. It is not native, and it grows well, but to actually find evidence that it is harmful to our native flora or to anything, well, people have failed there. There's no data that actually shows it's harmful. It's less harmful than the stinger nettle. The stinger nettle is quite invasive, and even really are stinger nettles that harmful? So yes, there's a broadening out and a reduction of a change in our definition of what is weedy and what is harmful. In the end, well, what really is harmful? Diversity is good.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's always us putting on we're making a judgment on nature, so we're just we're putting our opinion on just nature, and
absolutely
we're labeling it whatever way we kind of see fit. But have you told a butterfly that's a weed? Have you told a butterfly that's harmful? Have you told a foraging bee that nectar sac is a bad thing? I guess you don't. So,
yeah.
But I guess it must be nice in a way that in your working life that you've seen stuff that was considered weeds, back then are now coveted, and there is a I guess there is a resurgence in wildflower meadows as an aesthetic, but also as a as a necessity.
Absolutely. I mean, it had changed. I mentioned I was collecting seed in the east end of London at the beginning, and I recall walking down the street picking, I don't know what it was, dandelions out to a crack in a pavement or something, collecting the seed. And this guy came up to me. He said, "What the hell are you doing? You're a crazy man." I said, I'm collecting seed. He said, "You're nuts." He said, "You're absolutely nuts. You're wasting your time. Go away." But now we look upon the dandelion differently. It's one of the top pollinator. The services it provides is enormous. It's of the pollinator provision. It's way up there on the charts.
Okay, so tell the listeners. So because we're aware of what it does above ground, but it's also has, for some gardeners, an annoying taproot. But the taproot also plays a fantastic role in nutrient recycling as well. That's correct, isn't it? Where it brings, is it magnesium up to the
yeah. So grasses are fibrous and surface rooting in the top 10 centimeters of the ground, and dandelion has a taproot which will go down 1 meter.
Wow.
And so it can exploit the nutrients down through that layer. And when it does so, it also spreads fine roots laterally. So it has the ability to draw nutrients from deep down. It has the ability to survive drought because it's drawing moisture from deep down. And it's also depositing carbon throughout the soil profile when those fibrous roots die. And on a landscape scale, that's a really important contribution to carbon storage. Grass in our parks only stores carbon in the top 10 centimeters, but species-rich grassland will store it throughout the profile down 2 meters. So the conversion from park pure grass to species-rich grassland gives a huge net gain in storage of carbon. Not quite so much as planting trees, but a lot.
Yeah. Well, but it's interesting you're raising that, because again, it's when we talk about carbon storage, the only thing that it gets the press is we must plant 1,000 trees, 1 billion trees. We must do that, and that's the only way carbon is sequestered. But it's obviously not. But it's really interesting. So it brings up sort of an interesting discussion on how plants work as individuals and how that dynamic of plant communities within a meadow and how there's that interaction as well. Because do you want to just give a bit of background on perhaps if somebody wanted to establish, we've talked about it on a sort of a landscape scale, but I guess what I want to get across is people think that you buy a packet of seeds, you chuck the seeds down, and within 2 minutes you've got a wildflower meadow, and that's perhaps not as easy as that. So for people out there that want to know more about meadows, what is just sort of a kind of a life cycle? So from sort of seeding it to the short-term management, the medium-term management, to perhaps long-term management.
Well, you're right that there's a difference between tending plants in the garden and tending and creating a meadow. Garden plants are tended as individuals. You garden the individual, you look after the individual, but a meadow is a community, and you don't look after the individuals, you look after the community as a whole. And plants you have biennials, you have annuals, biennials and perennials. A meadow is primarily composed of perennial species. The annual species, if you sow an annual mixture with your perennial meadow, they will flower in the year after sowing. So if you sow in the autumn, they'll flower in the following June. If you can sow in the spring, and the annuals will flower June, July. But if you sow later that year, you end up having them flowering the following year. But if you sow at the same time the meadow mixture with the perennials, they will be vegetative. They won't flower in the first year after sowing. And some species take 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years to flower after sowing. So there's a succession of species that appear over time. You sow your meadow, you have the annuals flower first, then the biennials, like Dorcas, wild carrot, and then the fast establishing perennials like oxeye daisy, then the medium fast perennials like knapweed, and then the slow establishing perennials like cowslip, all over that, say, that 8 to 10 years, there'll be species appearing and flowering. And so over time, over that period, the diversity increases. The number of species you have each year becomes greater and greater and greater until you get to about year 10. And then it settles down, but it still doesn't look like the real thing that you might find at Thurfield Common.
Yeah.
That takes a bit longer. And what creates that is the second, third, and fourth generation of those perennials interacting with one another in the community. So by managing the community over a long period of time, it takes about 20 years to get to something that looks fairly, to most people, will look fairly like the real thing.
Yeah. So there's a lot to pick out of there. Because you've mentioned about the annuals. Now, I'm recording this from Cambridge. So what you'll see on the podcast underneath, there is a link. So there's a link to the pictures of the meadow you sowed outside of King's College in Cambridge. So what you use, correct me if I'm wrong, what you use there is you use the annuals as what perhaps you would call it the cover crop. Is that what you would call it? So
that's right. Yes.
So I forget his name now, Mr. Coggill, the head gardener there. So they put both mixes on, the annual and the perennial. So the annual gave an absolutely tremendous show. So they've harvested that this year. So the perennials will be up next year, and they'll be showing. So it's quite interesting as you talk about that interaction. So you've got the biennials, and then you've got the perennials. What things are, when you say they're interacting, what things are at play there? Is that nutrient availability? Is that more that, say, certain species do better in a wet year, certain species recede in a dry year? What are kind of general interactions are going on within that community?
Well, the interaction will vary according to the conditions in the site. So it'll be different situations, different locations will have different interactions. Essentially, the annuals, they require open ground.
Yeah.
And so open ground provides a situation where the factor of competition is low.
Yeah.
They are replaced in time by the biennials and perennials, but they are competing. That's not open ground then. It's a closed sward. And when you have that situation, competition becomes really important. So those individual plants are competing one with another. Some are helping each other. Some are actually harming their neighbours, but they're competing one with another for space and survival.
Interesting. So when you said helping one another, are you alluding to an actual symbiotic relationship from the roots, or is that just a turn of phrase that you used?
Yes. There's complex interactions between mycorrhizal fungi and higher plants, so flowers.
Yeah.
And the organic matter in the soil is degraded and digested by the fungus, but the fungus is linked to the roots of the higher plant, maybe it's an oxidase or knapweed, and in that process, the roots draw sugars from the fungus that's in the soil. So it's not just one benefiting and the other being exploited. There's usually a mutual benefit to both in that sort of partnership.
Yeah.
And there's very complex. That's all happens below ground, and then above ground there's complex interactions as well. And you have the obvious interaction between pollinators and flowers, because that's usually, but not always, a reward situation where the flower provides the butterfly with, say, nectar, and the nectar provides the flower with pollen from a plant it's previously visited. So there's a mutual gain on both sides.
Mm.
But you have situations when they're with pests and diseases where there's not necessarily a mutual relationship, it's exploitative. So all these interactions are going on all the time. And the plants are interacting one with another. They might be out topping each other to see who can get to the highest and get to the light. So there's competition for light, there's competition below ground for moisture, and there's competition for nutrients as well. So it's extremely complicated. A community is very, very vibrant and changing over time. And what's important is to just let it happen. And because you manage it, but not as you would manage a traditional garden. So you will lose some species, some will gain. So there's always fluctuation and change from over time.
I mean, I love this because again, it's trying to get the message out there that it's to sit on your hands and let it happen and not try and control and to watch it. And it's a case of management, not maintenance. It's trying to get that message out there that it's a totally different, way to look at it, isn't it? And it can get lost in certain people that it's you can't control this. And
well, the best bit of management advice I give to people: if you don't know what to do, don't do anything.
As you're saying that, I can just, we're in nature. We're in perhaps an
I mean, it stands to reason. Activity in the garden might be putting down slug parrots, cutting the lawn, putting a bit of herbicide down, digging over a patch of soil. All of these are harmful to wildlife. Mm. So if you can reduce the amount of activity in the garden, you'll have more wildlife. Mm.
So to that point as well. So you were saying that it's a long-term process. So from broadly speaking, you have this sort of 0 to 7, 0 to 10 window of trying to establish a biodiverse, species-rich grassland. So again, generally speaking, so the sort of the medium-term management, because again, I want to. Sorry if I'm, telling you to, telling people how to suck eggs, but it's really interesting that again that dichotomy between managing a garden where there's input, and there's fertilizer and there's lots of input, but generally speaking, what type of management would you be undertaking when managing a meadow?
There's two stages. One is actually sowing the meadow, and then there's the maintaining it.
Yeah.
When it comes to sowing, the most important thing in a garden situation is to have a weed-free, medium, fine, firm seed bed. It doesn't matter the time of the year, and to sow this on the surface and firm the seed in. That's the most important thing. And with management, the single most important operation is the 1 cut per year. And you can vary the time because the timing is important. Generally speaking, people will cut too late. Mid-July is the optimum time for maintaining biodiversity in a garden setting. But you can leave it later or you can do it earlier. But that 1 cut is the most important thing you do. And then if you have a weed problem or you perceive a weed problem, selectively cut those weeds. You don't spray them, you don't even need to pull them out, but just selectively cut. And with a scythe is a good way of doing that.
Scythe is a very good way to do it. So I wanted to just go back a couple of steps. So you said the timing of the cut's really important. So say you're cutting, again, sorry telling you how to suck eggs, but you're cutting too early. Say you cut mid-June, or say you cut mid-September. what is that? What's actually happening there? So say you cut too late. What would be the sort of, what would be detrimental by cutting too late?
So if it depends what your objectives are. If your objective is to reduce the nutrients return to the soil, the optimum date for cutting is Midsummer's Day, which is the 25th of June. And that is the traditional date on which traditional hay meadows would be cut. If you cut later, you remove less nutrients.
Yes.
However, the invertebrates benefit from a later cut, and you might get an extra generation of meadow brown butterflies, and you'll have extra forage for bees if you leave it to later. But if you leave it to so late in the year, to say September, you get a return of nutrients to the soil from the dying back meadow, which increases the fertility, and that in turn can increase the rankness of the meadow if it's on a rich soil in the following year. So on a poor soil, you can have a later cut and there's no long-term harm. But on a rich soil, it is better to have an earlier cut, early July or maybe even into June. So then vary it from year to year as well, and also vary it across the garden. So you have some areas which are kept late uncut and some areas which are cut sooner in the season.
Yeah. So some points out of that. So again, reducing fertility each year is important. So do you want to tell the people at home again, why do you want to reduce fertility? I go to the garden centre, we put fertilizer, we get manure on all year round. You know, why is it? Well, you're talking about reducing fertility. So what's the point of that?
Well, high fertility favours a small number of coarse grasses and what people would consider to be weeds, docks and thistles and nettles, and the coarse grasses are unsightly. So by reducing the fertility, those coarse, unsightly species are at a disadvantage, and also you allow a wider range of species to establish within the meadow. So you have greater diversity, a greater range of species. And also high fertility allows topping out and lodging. So the vegetation grows tall and flops over. And in doing so, that kills the low-growing rosette-forming species. Yeah. So by having low fertility, you have a more open structure, which allows a greater range of species to grow.
Okay, just coming back to that community, those different layers, isn't it? Those different layers, those different growth strategies, and but yeah, no, it's so interesting that again with those coarser grasses, how they can over dominate. So something that I wanted to go back to as well. You mentioned about varying times of cutting, but also even within the same garden, cutting areas a bit later, leaving an area long. That's quite interesting as well, because again, when you were saying that, I was thinking how that could easily be done on a sort of county council basis, because I know Plant Life, I mean, they've been banging that drum for years, but the Plant Life initiative to really reduce or reconsider how we maintain our verges, how we maintain highway land as well.
So yes, with grass cutting, it tends to be too early in the year, and it's good to leave the verge cutting until September. Yeah, and likewise hedge cutting no earlier than September, and hedges cut those no more frequently than once every 2 years, because with a hedge it won't produce winter berries on its current year's growth. So, and then in parks and gardens, where you have amenity grassland, just leave areas uncut. If you're not making a meadow by sowing seed, you could still leave the grass uncut and have just one cut later in the year. And where you have areas which are not cut at all, they have the function of providing hibernation sites for invertebrates over the winter, particularly species like cow parsley and hogweed, nettles, thistles, plants with a hollow stem. They fill up with earwigs and all sorts of bugs, and that's very important. Overwintering habitat is really important. So having an uncut area of the garden, not tidy, just leave it all, just right, don't deadhead anything, just leave it. And that's really important for overwintering, so that you'll then go into the spring with insects, invertebrates ready to come out of hibernation as soon as the temperature rises.
So can we get the message across today that the new rock and roll was being untidy in your garden? Because we need to be less tidy. We need to stop controlling. We need to just allow. Yeah, we just need to stop being too tidy in our garden.
There's beauty in natural mess.
I've just sorry, the way I'm laughing because that's like the headline from the podcast. That's the lovely soundbite. But there is, isn't there? If you look at, I think we've all probably been more connected with nature, present company excluded probably, but over the sort of COVID lockdown where we've all reconnected with it, and it's the minutiae, the beauty of the minutiae that we've missed. But if you just look at it, it's there is so much going on right underneath our noses.
Yeah.
So Donald, thank you very much for the podcast. That was been really fantastic. So where can people find out more about the great work you do at Emorsgate and sort of give us a bit of background on that?
Well, we have a seed catalogue, which is see that
the Bible, yes, the absolute Bible, yeah,
and a website, Emorsgateseeds.com, and just give them a call or an email, and any questions you have or any seed you want, well, just ask us, and we're there to advise and help you.
Thank you. Thanks, Donald. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.